Chapter 9. Celtic Connection? The library was a large panelled room, floorboards linking the walls to a well-worn carpet, their gleaming echo announcing the presence of anyone approaching its great oak doors. A library, but devoid of books. The absent landlord had given his house to the war effort, but not his precious collection. Though no longer a library, the room allowed trainees to relax during occasional idle moments between major exercises. In one corner were cups and saucers stacked on a covered table next to a large metal urn of hot water and a tin of biscuits, replenished regularly by the ever-present Alfred. Across the room was a mahogany cocktail bar, complete with a pump connected to a barrel of ale. Newspapers of the day, folded into wooden rods and stacked like umbrellas, were available next to a large polished walnut box containing the 4-valve radiogram. Their primary source of information was from newspapers. Radio broadcasts tended to happen when the trainees were otherwise engaged. TJ had been part of the British Expeditionary Force, and with some justification felt that he had barely survived. However, reports from across the Channel suggested that, in heading to Norway, his group had been lucky. Newspapers were full of the disaster that had unfolded on the beaches of Dunkirk, of the desperate fighting to slow the Germans, allowing some of the Allies to get back across the Channel. However, the newspapers were not revealing the full truth, the full horror and desperateness of Britain's position. Instead, they were filled with empty rhetoric, written by people who misremembered the Great War and had no understanding of blitzkrieg. Newspaper editors, in sweeping prose, were extolling the virtues of the British people, their courage and steadfastness, their delight and joy at the country's deliverance. But TJ could see none of this. No bunting in the streets, no celebrations. People were frightened. The newspapers were dealing in lies. Perhaps they'd been to previous courses at Winchester to learn their trade. The truth, however, was there for all to see. It was coming from the soldiers who got home. It was not what the soldiers said, for they would not speak. It was their appearance, their defeat, lost faces, the rags that they were left with, their missing weapons and armaments, their inability to hide their sense of shame. Truckloads of survivors arrived at the Army Training Centre across a field from the mansion. The intelligence trainees could only watch as hundreds of once proud men wandered away in silence to their billets. The trainees were ordered to gather in the library towards the end of their second week. Linda had received the text of a speech, the first made by Winston Churchill after he became Prime Minister. TJ remembered the name, having first heard it at the parade in Portree. Over the intervening 2 years, he had heard Churchill's name mentioned more and more as the old man was increasingly brought back into the limelight. In an almost miraculous resurrection, Churchill had become Lord of the Admiralty at the declaration of war, and then following the debacle of Norway and Chamberlain's resignation, he was elected Prime Minister. Everyone connected with the course was in that room. Not just the trainees and teaching staff, but Alfred and the cooks from the kitchen. Even the gardener had been invited along. Linda looked across to James. "Read this out, will you please? I think it is something we should all hear." She handed James several sheets of paper, and he raised his eyebrows at her, but then looked down to the text. The air was alive with suspense as James stood up and made his way to the top of the room. Then James spoke. He didn't look like Churchill, but TJ had never heard Churchill's voice, so perhaps he did have a slight South African accent. The voice was grave. As he started out, he spoke of the horror, of the shock, of the wasted efforts, of the great faith that had been set in the useless plans of the French. He described the awkwardness of the Belgians in refusing to allow British troops into their country unless they were under attack. In that library, for the time it took to read the speech, James became Churchill. The audience could see and hear their nation's leader in every word. He described how Germany rose up, how the masses of Herr Hitler exploded out of Eastern Europe like a sharp scythe around the right and rear of the armies of the North. He hid nothing, and in listening to him, TJ felt that they were standing side by side on the brink of destruction. Then Churchill stopped to draw breath. On continuing, his tone minutely changed. The death spiral of the first part of the speech had been halted. A ray of optimism was being injected. When, a week ago today, I asked the House to fix this afternoon as the occasion for a statement, I feared it would be my hard lot to announce the greatest military disaster in our long history. Here was the hope, breaking into the darkness with a chink of light. Churchill cleverly hinted at how this broadcast could have been much worse. How, instead of 300,000, perhaps only 30,000 might have escaped death or imprisonment. And that would indeed have been a disaster. In that one moment, a balding, chubby old man had repositioned what the people of Britain had feared was a great defeat into not even a setback, but salvation itself. A proof from God that Britain was in the right and would prevail. Churchill was old, and he had eaten well. But he had his weapons, and he was using them to the best of his ability. In homes and halls around the country, people were listening to Churchill's words, and finding resolve where they thought there was none. TJ had put the past behind him, had dedicated himself to the here and now, because there had been nothing else. He had accepted death and the void beyond because that was the truth, the future. But now he was hearing hope, a stirring, a possibility. If Churchill could fight, then so could he. As he looked around the room, he could see the change in those listening with him. Worry lines fading, straighter backs, nodding of heads, even quickening of breath. In hope, there could be love. Dare he think about Liz? The truth of it was that he had thought of little else since seeing her smile. James spoke for 16 minutes, his voice rising and falling like waves, with many peaks and troughs between a great ocean rhythm. Finally, it was clear to all that his speech was coming to an end. He was building to a crescendo. James had tears in his eyes, but his voice did not falter. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. Murmurs of agreement around TJ, his own fists clenched as he leaned forward in his seat. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Bloody right, said White. You bloody tell 'em, Winston. The room burst into spontaneous applause for the man who couldn't hear them, but had spoken to their hearts and given them hope. They were all standing now, TJ clapping and cheering along with the rest. A great smile formed across TJ's face, not least because he was looking into the eyes of Liz, who was smiling and laughing straight back at him.